and so did Kid Icarus Uprising. After all, it's been more than 25 years since the original action platformer on the NES, and aside from a Game Boy sequel a few years later, the series has remained completely dormant until now, which basically gave the developers a clean slate to offer a brand new experience while building on the events of the original, which is exactly what they've done here. You see, Kid Icarus Uprising drops a platforming element almost completely and instead focuses purely on the action. It does this by breaking almost every level into two gameplay types. Most levels begin with a Star Fox-like on-rails segment where you control Pit as he follows a preset path, blasting everything in sight. This lasts for about 5 minutes or so before Pit invariably lands, which is when the game turns into more of a third-person shooter. Although both halves are basically shooters at their core and share similar elements, they also both end up feeling completely different, which is why I'm going to tackle them separately. And like the game itself, let's start with the on-rails shooter part. So although I mentioned this portion is similar to Star Fox, it's actually even closer to Sin and Punishment on the Wii, as you control both Pit and the aiming reticule independently. Hell, you can even perform a melee attack on enemies that get too close for comfort. Like I said, it's almost identical. Let me cut right to the chase. These parts are fantastic. The controls are extremely responsive and the environments you fly through are simply gorgeous. At points, it actually ends up feeling more like an amusement park ride than a game. Between the dramatic swoops through beautiful vistas, the nearly constant lighthearted chatter between Pit and the other gods, and the countless near misses, it really does feel like Nintendo's take on Disneyland's Star Tours attraction, with you as the pilot. And the fantastic use of the 3D screen only adds to the effect, making for one of the most immersive rail shooters I've played. I really only have two complaints with the flying sections. The first is that sometimes the action gets a little too hectic, making it hard to tell exactly what's going on. Secondly, the levels are almost entirely linear and very rarely give you the choice of multiple routes. A little more freedom would have made the levels more replayable. Ooh, and there is just one other problem. The flying sections aren't the whole game. In fact, they're only about 1/3 of it. Instead, the rest of the game is made up of the aforementioned on-ground segments, and that's where things start to fall apart. Let's break it down. Right away, you'll notice that the controls are similar, but also quite different. The circle pad still moves Pit, and the touchscreen still controls the reticule, but everything's a bit more complicated now, like turning. In order to change where you're facing, you need to flick the stylus on the touchscreen to rotate the camera. Unfortunately, it's horribly imprecise. You'll either turn too little or far too much and overshoot your target. It's a constant battle to keep the screen facing where you need it to be, especially when enemies are all around you, which is most of the time. It would have been better if the game only allowed you to spin 180 degrees at most. I mean, there's no point in allowing me to do anything more than that. And then there's the combat itself. The combat is built around using dash attacks, which are more powerful than standard attacks. These moves are performed by jamming the circle pad in any direction to dash, then tapping the fire button to fire the shot. If that sounds familiar, it's probably because they're performed almost exactly like smash attacks from Super Smash Bros. And while it worked great in that series, it introduces a few problems here. For one, performing a smash, dash on the circle pad is considerably harder than on the proper control stick, partially due to the smaller travel distance and lower profile. Secondly, I couldn't stand the way they actually work during combat. Basically, each time you perform a dash attack, it interrupts your movement, forcing you to perform another one afterward to get moving again. This actually wouldn't be that big of a deal if you didn't end up using dash attacks all the time. It lends a very stuttery nature to the game's combat, making it feel significantly less smooth than the flying portions. And to compound the issue, trying to perform dash attacks repeatedly while cradling the 3DS with one hand and using the stylus with the other is simply the most uncomfortable game experience I can think of since the Virtual Boy. Now I should mention that Kid Icarus Uprising does come with a free stand at the time of this video, and it helps a little, but it still didn't solve the ergonomic issues my left hand experienced while playing the on-foot portions of this game. Now the game does offer some alternate control schemes, such as using the face buttons to move Pit and using the circle pad for aiming instead, but they all have their own problems that don't offer the level of accuracy or precision that the game demands. Getting back to the combat, you also have a wide variety of powers that you can equip and use when battling on foot. These include making you run really fast, jumping really high, or firing a really big laser. They're pretty cool and occasionally useful, but, and you knew there was a but coming, the interface for selecting them is terrible. The thing is that the powers are relegated to a small corner on the touchscreen, which means in order to use one, you need to take your eyes off the action on the top screen and use the stylus to select the power you're going to use, which means you can't aim during this time either. Basically, you're a sitting duck, and even worse, since it can equip many more powers that can be displayed at a time, you need to clunkily scroll through them to find the one you need. Really, it's a giant pain in the neck, and the time and effort it takes almost isn't worth it. Now I should mention they can also use the control pad to scroll through and activate powers, but that involves taking your thumb off the circle pad, which means Pit is even more of a sitting duck than before. It would have been a far better option to implement a pause screen based power system, where you can carefully choose whichever power you'd like without having to worry about being clobbered by enemies. And then there's the camera, which is far too close, making it hard to gain spatial awareness. You wouldn't believe how many times I ran off a ledge that I couldn't see simply because I was trying to perform a dash attack. Putting aside the combat and the controls, the on-foot environments themselves also pale in comparison to the flying portions. Most levels have you exploring room after room that all look identical. It reminded me of the first Halo, which had great outdoor environments, but dull, repetitive indoor ones. And like I said, most of your time is going to be spent going through them. It really feels as if the developers went out of their way to make the on-foot portions as annoying as possible. And I didn't even touch on everything that annoyed me, such as how it's hard to tell which ledges you can or can't fall off of, and the annoyance of running out of stamina, which leaves Pit a heaving, defenseless mess. And that happens far more than it should. With all that being said, there are a couple moments in the on-foot portions that are really cool, which I won't reveal because they are huge spoilers, but they're just too few in numbers. And that's rather unfortunate because the bulk of the game is spent on foot. Now there is something else I haven't touched on yet, and that's a variable difficulty. Essentially, you have full control over how challenging each level is, at least that is when starting the level. The thing is, in order to up the difficulty, you need to bet hearts, which is the game's currency. If you successfully complete the stage without dying, you'll earn more hearts as a reward. But if you lose, your potential jackpot will drop, and the game will boot you to a lower difficulty level. It actually sounds really cool, on paper, but in practice, it simply made the game more aggravating for me. The thing is, dying in almost any game is punishment enough by itself, but Kid Icarus makes it brutally so by taking away hearts for each death. Then it makes a mockery of you by forcing you to replay the level at a lower difficulty level. Essentially, it punishes you for trying to challenge yourself, and then it prevents you from trying again. It can be really just a very frustrating experience. And it introduces another problem, but it's for something we haven't talked about yet, the game's diverse weapon set. This game has a ton of weapons, and you'll acquire more all the time, whether it's by finding them in levels or using the hearts you earn to buy more. You can even take those weapons and fuse two of them together to create a brand new one that retains elements of both. Unfortunately, even with so many weapons, most of them feel pretty much the same, with the main distinctions being how powerful they are at long and short range attacks. And the constantly changing difficulty levels, that is, if you like to challenge yourself, makes it really hard to gauge your weapon's effectiveness since it obviously varies based on how challenging the enemies are. Taking all this together, it results in a very sloppy, frustrating experience, especially for the on-foot portions. But it's not all bad. In fact, some elements of this game are among the very best Nintendo's ever done. The script, for instance, is one of the funniest I've ever heard in a single-player game, second only to Portal 2.
The monster situation is quite clement.
Are you still speaking English right now?
Let me make this easier for you. Big monsters kill Pit! Grrr!
Ah, that makes perfect sense!
The characters are constantly making fun of each other and even poke fun at the very mechanics of the game itself. It breaks the fourth wall constantly, such as by referencing other Nintendo properties and even some non-Nintendo ones. And the game even makes a few adult jokes that will go right over most kids' heads.
Ooh! A hot spring!
This coming from the guy who can't even be bothered to take his clothes off.
The great script is brought to life by some very competent voice acting, including one important character who seems to be doing his best Phil Hartman impression. And even the main villain, who I can't reveal because of spoilers, has more in common with the very best Disney villains than any of Nintendo's. I really can't rave enough about the script and excellent voice work, which is by far the best work Nintendo's ever done. It single-handedly is what kept me going through the on-foot missions, which I could barely stand otherwise. All in all, Kid Icarus' single player is 1/3 great, but 2/3 tedious, but it's partially saved by a remarkable script and fantastic cinematic presentation, which is why, taken as a whole, I'm giving the single player 3 out of 5 stars. But we're not done yet, as Kid Icarus Uprising has a multiplayer mode too, for both local and online play. It features 2 modes, Free-for-All, which is self-explanatory, and Light vs. Dark, where 2 teams of 3 try to decimate the opponent's health meter. The catch is that, when the meter runs out, the player responsible for the loss turns into a powerful angel, giving them one last chance at success. But if he dies, it's game over. It's actually a pretty cool idea for a gameplay mode, as I haven't seen anything quite like it in another game. Unfortunately, as you've probably noticed, the entire multiplayer mode is built around the same on-foot mechanics as in the main game, which, as you've probably guessed, means most of those same problems are present here as well. As such, it was hard for me to enjoy my time with the multiplayer mode, which is why I'm giving it 2.5 out of 5 stars. Thanks for watching our video review, and make sure to visit GameXplain.com for much more.